what we call zoonotic diseases, diseases that pass from non-human animals into humans because we come in contact with the animals and we give the viruses an opportunity to jump into us. I suppose some of the things that surprised me was coming to realize that most human infectious diseases fall into this category. 60 to 70% of our infectious diseases are zoonotic diseases in the strict sense, passing recently or repeatedly from non-human animals into humans. And that ranges from Ebola to the original SARS coronavirus to HIV, which passed from a single chimpanzee into a single human much longer ago than most people would expect, back in around 1908, give or take a margin of error, and then gradually developed slowly into the AIDS pandemic. So it was surprising to me to recognize that all of these infectious diseases are zoonoses, and that they connect us with the natural world in a peculiar way. Shared viruses, shared diseases, shared evolutionary history with other animals. The other thing that surprised me was coming to recognize that viruses are very natural. The world is filled with viruses. All forms of wild animals carry unique viruses, living within them, in most cases quietly. And if they are disrupted, then those viruses have the potential to latch onto humans and become human viruses and even human pandemics.
So this leads us to today. And I don't think this is too much of a spoiler to say that in the final pages of the book, David interviews experts to get their predictions about what's going to happen. Keep in mind, this was in 2012. And Gerald Burke, who, as a Pittsburgher, I'm proud to say was the dean of the School of Public Health at the University of Pittsburgh, predicted specifically a coronavirus pandemic. And earlier in the book, David identifies animal markets in China as a possible point of spillover for these viruses. So, okay, here we are. On June 11th, we have this coronavirus pandemic, which emanated, as best as we can tell, from China. But does anything about this, the nature of this pandemic, surprise you, David, after all the expertise you accumulated and shared on this issue?
Well, as you say, Jeffrey, Don Burke at the School of Public Health, the University of Pittsburgh, and others had predicted in various different sections, had predicted this whole scenario that we have. Coronavirus coming out of an animal, very possibly a bat, very possibly in a wet market, in a place such as China, causing a new pandemic if we were very unlucky, and we have been very unlucky. What surprised me most as this thing got going on, and I was in Tasmania as this thing got going on. I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times that was published in January 28th, warning that this new thing could be a pandemic. We should take it very seriously. And then I went to Tasmania for 3 weeks to research another book, spending time with Tasmanian devil biologists. And the whole thing blew up while I was there in Tasmania, essentially during the month of February. What surprised me most was how unprepared we were, how unprepared the United States was, how unprepared many other nations were to deal with this. I'll give you just one example of that. Back in about 2010, when I was researching spillover, I talked with a brilliant scientist named Ian Lipkin at Columbia, the School of Public Health at Columbia in New York. And he was working on these viruses and doing the molecular analysis of viruses that were captured in the wild by some of the scientists that I was following around through jungles and rooftops and caves. And Ian Lipkin told me that he and his lab were working on what he called a green chip that would allow fast, accurate, real-time diagnostic testing, so that in the time that it takes a person to go through airport security, you could take a swab from the mouth and run it into a machine that had a chip with the genome of the new virus. And by the time that person came out on the other side, picked up her briefcase, put her computer back in it, put on her shoes, we would know whether she was positive or negative for this virus. I was astonished that no such technology existed 10 years later when this thing began. It would have helped so much. Other public health measures, enough personal protective equipment, enough ventilators, coordinated plans. How would the United States react if a pandemic got into the US? The fact that the CDC had produced or had commissioned test kits which were defective. All of these forms of Keystone Cops, disorganized, inefficient, incompetent response surprised me greatly. The coronavirus coming out of southern China, or coming out of central China, did not surprise me.
Mm-hmm. And what's so disturbing about what you're saying is your book, which, by the way, this is a book that was published by Norton, a major publisher, predicted that this could happen. And not only the book itself, but the experts interviewed in the book and other channels predicted that this would happen. So we can't say that we didn't know that something like this could happen. In fact, it was likely that something like this would happen.
Absolutely, absolutely. The scientists knew, scientists like Peter Daszak, president of EcoHealth Alliance in New York, scientists like Don Burke in Pittsburgh, other scientists like Dr. Robert Webster in Memphis, a wonderful, great influenza specialist that I talked to. They knew that there would be challenges like this, that very dangerous viruses would emerge, coronaviruses or influenzas or some other form of new virus coming from animals, challenging humans, causing illness, and if transmissible, causing outbreaks and epidemics that could become pandemics. The scientists knew, the public health people knew, like Dr. Ali Khan at the CDC, now at the University of Nebraska Public Health School. He's the main character in my New Yorker piece from about a month ago. He knew this sort of thing was coming. And the public health people were warning the political leaders. So the political leaders were hearing this. It was not unknown to them, but they were brushing it off. They were ignoring it. They were making risk-averse decisions, deciding not to spend the money and the political capital to create networks of highly efficient, fast-responding preparedness. So it was political decisions, political calculation that has cost us so dearly.
The interested audience, if you'd like to pose a question, please put it in the chat. We'll get to those in just a few minutes. Of course, the best, there's, when it comes to pandemic preparation, there's two aspects to it. There's, of course, making sure you have, as you mentioned, the ventilators, the personal protective gear, the plans to deal with the pandemic. But the best prevention, the best plan of all is to prevent a pandemic from happening. So with that in mind, what do you see as a bigger threat in terms of producing another pandemic? Deforestation or factory farms?
The root causes of the contacts with the disruptive contacts with wild animals that lead to these spillovers. Yeah, that's an important thing to talk about. What are the ultimate causes? Well, the ultimate causes, I think of us on planet Earth now as having three huge problems that run parallel to one another and have the same root causes. And the three huge problems are the threat of pandemic disease, climate change, and loss of biological diversity, which is a loss that hurts humans, but it's also an inherent loss of beauty and wonder and diversity on planet Earth. So those three things have the same root causes, and the root causes are human impact on the rest of the natural world. All of the choices that we make as individuals, as well as societies, what we eat, what we wear, what we buy, how much we travel, the minerals that we use, the timber, the forests that we cause to be cut down, the fossil fuels that we use, how many children we have, if we choose to have children, all of those things add up to our individual footprints on the rest of the natural world. And the greater the total footprint of humans, the greater the disruption of natural ecosystems, the greater the contact with wild animals that carry their own unique viruses, the greater the chance of spillovers. Spillover, I should make clear, spillover is a word that describes that moment when a new disease agent, such as a virus, passes from its non-human animal host into its first human. That's the spillover. Those occur because of human contact with wild animals. When you have a spillover, then there's a chance that it passes from human to human and becomes an outbreak. 20 or 30 people in a remote forest village somewhere may be affected. If the outbreak spreads, it becomes an epidemic across a country. If the epidemic spreads, it becomes a pandemic. The beginning of it all is the spillovers because of contact with wild animals. I don't think we can ever eliminate those spillovers entirely, but with planning of the sort that I mentioned earlier, science, technology, public health, international coordination, we can contain those spillovers. But we need to be concerned about the frequency of the spillovers themselves. And the spillovers are caused by the kind of thing that you just mentioned. They're caused by deforestation. They're caused by humans going into wild ecosystems and eating the wildlife there, capturing the wildlife, transporting the wildlife to markets. Factory farming is definitely also a contributing factor, yes, as in the case that I describe in the book of a Nipah virus in Malaysia, which was a very dangerous virus, is a very dangerous virus. It's carried by fruit bats, but as northern Malaysia was deforested, the fruit bats lost their habitat. They came looking for other forms of fruit, and what they found were great pig farms with fruit trees planted over the piggeries. So they came to the fruit trees and they ate the fruit and dropped the pulp and dropped their feces and dropped their urine into these great corrals of pigs. The pigs picked up the virus, spread it from one to another, eventually spread it to the pig farmers, to the butchers, to the pork dealers, and it killed a number of people. It's a very dangerous virus. So that's one of the situations in which factory farming multiplies the danger of spillovers becoming outbreaks because concentrated domestic animals represent a great vulnerable intermediate host that viruses from wild animals can get into and then pass from into humans.
So you mentioned we have to look at what individuals are doing and what societies are doing. So let's break that down a bit. What, as individuals, what changes can we make to reduce the likelihood that we'll face another pandemic?
As individuals, good. That's a good place to start. Well, I mentioned the choices that we make, what we buy, what we eat, what we wear, how much we travel, how much we reproduce, how many children we have. All of those factors are worth, each person needs to think about those as contributing to the ultimate causes of this problem and also those two other problems that I mentioned, loss of biological diversity and climate change. I'll put this the spotlight on myself. I am trying to do better. I am trying to reduce my imprint. I need to I don't have children. I travel a lot. I need to travel less. I am not a vegetarian, but I need to eat less meat, and I know that, and I'm moving in that direction. Less all the time. What else? The things that we buy. Um, almost all of us have a cell phone. This is a reminder that there's enough responsibility to go around. Even if you have no children, you're a vegetarian, you don't fly around on airplanes. If you have a cell phone, then you are a consumer of the mineral coltan, which is used to make tantalum capacitors necessary in cell phones and in laptop computers. Where does coltan come from? It comes from a very few places on Earth, including the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, where it is mined in forest areas adjacent to Kahuzi-Biega National Park and Itombwe Nature Reserve, areas that are filled with wild animals, many species of primate, many species of rodent, many species of bat, lowland gorillas. We buy a cell phone, we commission miners to go in there and get the coltan for us. What do they eat? They need protein. Are they going to have tofu? No. Are they going to subsist just on manioc and rice? No. They're going to eat bushmeat. And therefore, they're going to expose themselves and potentially the rest of the world to the viruses that those animals carry. So many things we do involve a portion of responsibility for this whole problem. The first step, I think, is for everybody to admit that we have, if you live and breathe and eat and walk around on planet Earth, you have a portion of this responsibility. Secondly, if we live in affluent communities in the United States, in the West, we consume more than, say, children in an African village. So population numbers is not the whole thing. Population numbers multiplied by consumption is what equals the human imprint. So equity, fairness, reversing the great disparities of wealth is another part of this problem. So we have to think about that. We have to think about the fact that there are many people in parts of the world, not by choice, who are consuming much, much less, I know, than I am, and probably that you are, and most of our friends and neighbors are consuming. So the first step for individuals is to take ownership of the responsibility for, in terms of personal choices.
No, thank you so much for that response. And of course, what you're talking about applies not just to preventing future pandemics, but climate change and a whole host of environmental problems. Question from Jeffrey Schrager, which is a perfect segue, which is, what should we be doing as societies? And I'd like to add something to that. Is there any evidence that governments and international agencies are absorbing the message from this pandemic about what we should be doing to prevent the next one?
Yes, well, good questions. Thank you. Thank you both, Jeffries. Yes, certainly the World Health Organization is absorbing the message that this has gone badly. They need to do better, and individual governments need to do better, particularly the US and Great Britain, whose responses to this have been disastrous. A few countries have done much better. Singapore has done much better. Republic of Korea has done much better. Germany has done much better. Italy has been very unlucky. Brazil has done poorly. Brazil is being hammered right now. So there's a great differential around the world as to how badly this pandemic has been hitting at particular times. Our societies need to be much better prepared, and that means not just spending money to stockpile PPE and to stockpile ventilators and to have more isolation beds in the United States so that we feel safe and we can deal with this. The first step for societies is to recognize, as Ali Khan, whom I mentioned earlier, great public health mind, said to me, in this day and age with our globalization, a disease anywhere is a disease everywhere. We have to recognize that viruses don't respect borders. And for instance, when Donald Trump announced in late January that he was closing the United States to Chinese people and to people who foreigners who had recently traveled to China. And then he thought, okay, I've done what I need to do, and now we're going to be fine. He failed to recognize that this virus was already in the United States, that it transmits very well, that this virus is not a Chinese person. So that by keeping Chinese persons out of the US, you don't keep this virus out of the US. It got here, and it got here with a vengeance. Now we are the worst in the world. So from our leaders, from our societies, we need not just the material preparations, we need a willingness to coordinate internationally, to recognize that a disease anywhere is a disease everywhere. Don't send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee, the wonderful old John Donne quote. So we need internationally coordinated systems of surveillance and response. Work to detect a spillover when it happens, when it's just infecting 20 people in a remote African village. Is it a new virus? Well, it seems to be a new virus. Well, let's get that virus. Let's isolate it. Let's sequence it. Let's get that genomic sequence out around the world. Let's have platform vaccines already developed that can be modified to become specific vaccines, by which I mean we might have a generalized corona vaccine platform, and when we have a new coronavirus, we can modify that platform very quickly and produce specific vaccines with international cooperation. The international flow of information, of resources, and of political will to deal with an outbreak before it becomes an epidemic, and an epidemic before it becomes a pandemic. There are some international systems and efforts in place. There's an effort called CEPI, Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, I think. Bill Gates has put, and his wife Melinda have put a lot of money into that for vaccine development. That's important. There is the Global Outbreak Alert Response Network, GOARN. There is the World Health Organization. These organizations need more support. They need more trust. I won't say they need more power, because some people are very wary of international organizations that have power. They need more responsibility. They need more trust. They need more capacity to coordinate responses that move across borders. So that's the best I can do in answer to Jeffrey's question.
In terms of, of course, you mentioned nipping pandemics in the bud all around the world. But in terms of reducing deforestation and dealing with the issue of factory farms, do you see any evidence that, or any recognition even, that policymakers are attuned to these issues in light of this pandemic?
I guess I have to give a short answer to that, and the short answer is no. I don't see that evidence yet. I think we citizens are going to have to keep the pressure on. This horrible catastrophe that we call COVID-19 is going to, it's not going to go away suddenly. It's going to abate gradually, I think, when we get a vaccine in a year or a year and a half, I hope. That will help a lot, but the virus will still be with us. We need to use this catastrophe as an opportunity for a major reset in a lot of ways. And our political leaders need to hear it, and business needs to hear it. Big agriculture needs to hear it. Big pharma needs to hear it. We need to conduct ourselves differently. How do you get to that point? I don't know. I'm not a public policy person. I don't have those answers. I'm just a guy that follows disease scientists around in forests. But it seems to me we need to treat this as a horrible opportunity for a major reset. Some people talk about, I'll just add a little sidelight. They talk about reparations. Oh, maybe there should be reparations. Maybe China should pay reparations for having let this cat out of the bag, having been less than fully opaque in the month of December that this virus was transmitting from human to human. And there is culpability there, I think, for China. In a lot of ways, China's response has been good, but not in all ways. So should China pay reparations? Well, if we're going to ask China to pay reparations, then what about the 1918 influenza? Who let that cat out of the bag? We still don't know exactly where that influenza began, but one of the strong hypotheses is that it began on a hog farm, I believe, in Kansas. Industrial agriculture, United States of America. Are we going to pay reparations for the 1918 influenza pandemic that killed 50 million people around the world? All right, if we're going to talk about reparations, let's factor that in too.
No question, when you're talking about America or China, the bill has come due for, in terms of how we treat animals, and we're paying a huge price. Let me ask you this, this is a scary question. As you said, this pandemic is not going to disappear overnight, but what would you say is the risk level that a second global pandemic will emerge before we're even done with this one?
Well, the risk level is non-zero. It's very difficult to predict, but yes, you're absolutely right. One of the things that we should be concerned about as we try and get past the worst of this, and get toward a vaccine, is that possibly before we have a vaccine deployed, and possibly right as we are hit with the second wave of this virus, this disease, we could very well have another pandemic infection moving around the world. We could have a nasty influenza that emerges in the Northern Hemisphere in October in traditional flu season. And if we have a nasty influenza compounding the problems of the SARS coronavirus 2, that'll be terrible. That will really be an ugly scenario. Is that highly improbable? No, it's not highly improbable. Is it definitely going to happen? No, there's no way of saying. Don Burke, to revert to him because I respect him so much, told me, you can't predict these things. You can suggest what some likelihoods are, but he had talked about coronaviruses before SARS 1, and I said, did you predict that? And he said, no, I made a lucky guess. So it can't be predicted with any confidence, but the possibility is not insignificant that we could be hit with a bad influenza compounding our efforts to deal with wave number 2 of the coronavirus. And that would be an ugly scenario around the world.
You mentioned vaccines. With HIV, which we've never had a vaccine for HIV, correct? What should give us any confidence that there'll be a vaccine for the coronavirus when, after all these decades, efforts to find a vaccine for HIV have failed?
Well, there are different kinds of viruses. They have a taxonomy. They fall into families and genera that are parallel to the families and genera and orders in which we categorize animals and plants. HIV is a retrovirus. It evolves very, very quickly. It has a high rate of mutation, and it can evolve even within the body of a single patient, within the body of a single host, a single person. It can evolve over time as it replicates. And that's part of what, I think largely what has made the search for an AIDS vaccine so difficult for the last 40 years. We never imagined in 1981, when we started hearing about this and realized in 1982 or 83 that it was caused by a virus, we never realized that it would take 40 years and there'd still be no vaccine. Although there are now effective drug therapies if you are lucky enough to have access to them. Influenzas evolve very quickly also. That's the reason we need a new flu vaccine every year, because there's a new strain usually coming out of Southern Asia, Southeastern Asia, for reasons I could describe it. That tends to be where influenzas begin, not without exception, but it tends to be where they start because people live in close contact with domestic poultry, and domestic poultry and pigs tend to be the intermediaries of the new influenzas that come from wild aquatic birds. So they get from the wild aquatic birds into the domestic poultry. People live closely with their domestic poultry. They become infected. It transmits from human to human. You have a new influenza. Evolving quickly because of the nature of the influenza family of viruses. High mutation rate, genomes that reassort, mix and match parts. So the influenzas are always changing. After the retroviruses, such as HIV, and after the influenzas, coronaviruses evolve quickly, and certain other families of viruses, but not as quickly as influenza, not as quickly as HIV. So the fact that this virus evolves is what makes it capable of infecting humans, but it doesn't evolve so quickly that we cannot develop a vaccine for it. We ought to be able to develop a vaccine for it, and that vaccine ought to be good for more than a year. It doesn't evolve as fast as influenza.
I just read something yesterday which is very timely for this discussion, which is there are currently different coronaviruses circulating in some factory farms, which leads to this question. In terms of the type of disease which is most likely to produce the next pandemic, would you say it's another type of coronavirus, or dare I say H5N1, a type of influenza that's at a mortality rate of 50%?
Yeah, the so-called high pathogen avian influenza. Jeffrey, I think either of those are plausible candidates for the next pandemic. Influenzas, certainly, they are always plausible candidates. Influenzas can be terrible and they can kill a lot of people, and they evolve very quickly. And H5N1 is highly pathogenic in humans, as you say, with a kill rate that's almost as high as Ebola, but it doesn't transmit from human to human so far.
Yeah, so far.
Could it evolve to transmit from human to human? Absolutely. Would that be a nightmare scenario? Yes, sir, it would. So the coronaviruses, there's a diversity of coronaviruses circulating in wild animals, in bats. In China, we know there's a diversity of coronaviruses. In pangolins, also a diversity of coronaviruses. On factory farms, well, I've read in the last couple of days about thousands of mink that have been culled, that have been killed on mink farms in, I believe it was the Netherlands, because they were discovered to be hosting this virus. They got it probably from humans, from caretakers of this mink farm. So it probably passed from humans to mink, and then it was transmitting among the mink. So they considered that a risk factor, and they killed all, large numbers of mink. Coronaviruses, influenza viruses, and there are some others. There are some other dangerous groups like the Paramyxoviruses, another family, which included that one that I mentioned, Nipah virus, that came out of bats in Malaysia and also comes out of them in Bangladesh. It's very lethal in people, but it doesn't spread easily from humans to humans. Could there be a new form of that would be much more dangerous? Yes, absolutely.
All right, David, I told you 45 minutes. We have some great questions from the audience. You can spare a couple more minutes.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much. You've been so generous with your time. Question from Monique, and it's a 4-part question. Monique, I'll just ask the first part because it's, I think, so important. She's a student who's going to be going to college in the fall, but she's nervous about her dorm room. What do you have an opinion, a take, any perception about what we should be doing about education, both at the college level and K through 12 in the fall?
Well, first of all, I have huge sympathy with Monique for her concern about that question. It's a serious question. What's the answer? I don't know. I don't know. If I were her age, or if I had a daughter her age, I would be concerned about that too. I don't know what the right model is. I think that she should continue to think about this and stay flexible. It might turn out that when autumn comes, when September comes, we're starting to see a second wave. It might possibly be inadvisable to move into a dorm with a roommate and to socialize and eat in the cafeteria and to have contact with, with dozens and dozens of new friends. I mean, that's such an important experience. It's such a valuable experience. It's such a loss if that's not possible, and I recognize that. But it could be very dangerous still this autumn. Will it be for sure? I can't predict. I have this. It's not really just a ball. It's just a knickknack, and so I can't see the future in it.
Yeah.
But I wish you good luck, Monique. Think about that carefully, and take it seriously. Don't laugh it off. It's not to be laughed off. It's to be considered as a genuinely serious public health decision for your own safety. And again, I sympathize and I wish you good luck. It's a tricky question.
In a sense, it's the same question we've had to deal with in the past 2 weeks about the Black Lives Matter protests.
Absolutely, that's right.
There's competing interests, social justice and public health.
That's right. That's right. Yes. I've just had knee surgery and I can't walk very well. Otherwise, I would have been with my wife at some of the protests that she's gone to in the last week or so. I think it's a hugely important moment, long overdue. We talked a little bit about racial disparities and disparities of opportunity. It's crazy that Black people in this country are still having to scream into their pillows their frustration, their anger, 52 years after Dr. King was assassinated. It's crazy. So now is the time to do something about it.
No, and of course, these issues, as we know, overlap to a certain degree because the Black community has been disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. So they do overlap. They overlap in terms of the safety considerations of protest, but they also overlap in terms of COVID-19 having been another blow that has landed disproportionately on poor people, and in this country on African American people, whether they're poor or affluent. Why is that? We need to think about that. All the ways that that the systemic racism, which does exist in this country, has punished and continues to punish this group of our fellow citizens.
No, thank you for highlighting this issue. I'd like to pivot and refer back to something you said a few minutes ago. You talked about your personally attempting to reduce your meat consumption to reduce your ecologic footprint, and in so doing, make your own contribution to reducing the chances of a next pandemic. But what about in terms of dealing with this pandemic? And this is a question from Kathy. The question is, have you seen any research indicating that eating a plant-based diet is protective against the worst cases of COVID-19?
Kathy, the answer is I haven't seen any of that research, any research suggesting that. It's a plausible question. It's something that's worth examining. What are the factors that make an individual person more or less susceptible to this particular virus, this particular disease, now that it has spilled over and it's part of the human population? You know, diet certainly could be a factor. Secondary factors like smoking is suspected in northern Italy to be perhaps one of the causes. Air pollution, one of the causes. The way we live in our environment and what we put in our bodies certainly could be part of this. Genetic factors could also be part of it, but we really don't know. There's so much that we don't know about this virus and the way it hits humans. That's one of the things that, as far as I can tell, we just don't know about this.
I think we can safely say this: anything that makes you healthier can only help.
Absolutely.
Right, because one thing we have seen, that's, I would say this is a scientific consensus, is that if you have underlying chronic disease, you're much more likely to have a bad outcome.
That's right.
In this pandemic. Right. And obviously a plant-based, not obviously, but the research does show that a healthy plant-based or vegan diet reduces the likelihood that you will have a chronic disease and might even help you reverse a chronic disease.
I'm sure you're right, Jeffrey.
Yeah.
And I mean, just taking the factors of diabetes and obesity. Diabetes and obesity are secondary conditions that increase your susceptibility, it seems, to this virus. And I'm sure that a healthy plant-based diet tends to produce a population with much lower levels of obesity and diabetes.
All right, one more question, and this is a big one. And I did let David know I would be asking this question. I don't know what he's going to say, folks, but here we go. Hypothetically speaking, what would be the likelihood of another pandemic if the world was vegan?
Yes, a good question.
Thank you.
The likelihood, I think, would be lower. Would it be lowered to zero? Probably not. Then again, it's hard. Vegan diets are a goal, are a highly salubrious thing. I can't imagine all 7.8 billion humans becoming vegan. I don't know how we would get there. Seems to me that no matter how persuasive the case for vegetarianism and vegan diets is, it will at best be a very slow transition that involves new forms of protein becoming available to people who live in African villages and other situations around the world. So it's hard for me to imagine how that plays out. But as a general thing, vegan diets tend to reduce the factors that cause spillovers that lead to pandemics. Yes.
Right. Thank you so much, David. In keeping with David's final answer, I just wanted to share with everybody, Jewish Virgin, before the end of the month, is about to launch a major campaign called Toward a Pandemic-Free World, which will educate people about the connection between the consumption of animals and some of these zoonotic diseases that David talked about today. And we'll also have a program called Plant Pathways, which, David, you might be interested yourself, which will be a free program that will help people transition to plant-based diets. So, David, thank you so much for being so generous and sharing your time and giving us your expertise, which I know our audience really appreciates.
Jeffrey, thank you. I love talking with you. I love the chance to interact with your audience. I love getting the questions. Good luck with your very important work.
Okay, and David, we look forward to your next book, which I know personally I will be buying, but in the meantime, and I mean this sincerely, you can read my review on Goodreads, which look, I give plenty of bad reviews on Goodreads. Get Spillover and read it. It's really essential reading during this pandemic. You will emerge from that book much more knowledgeable about the nature of these viruses and pandemics. So thank you for your work.
I hope, Jeffrey, that if any of your listeners do get the book, they'll discover that it's filled with detective stories, and there is even a dark sort of fun involved in reading it. I hope that's what I was.
No, that was definitely my experience. As depressing as the topic was, it was actually, it's quite a lively read.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks again, David. All my best to you. And thank you, everybody, for devoting time this morning to this important webinar. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.